Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, Data to Drive Decisions. How can research inform philanthropic giving? My name is Sally Ray, and I am the Director of Domestic Funds for the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Some reminders today before we get started. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the panel presentation. If you're on Twitter, please use hashtag CDP4Recovery, that's CDP, the number 4 recovery, to share and join the discussion. And don't forget to follow us on @FundsForDisaster. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete this, and because this helps us improve our webinar offerings to better meet your needs. And finally, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. Live captioning is available now via Zoom. Click on closed caption live transcript to access it. More accurate captions will be in the recording. This webinar is sponsored, it's co-sponsored by Giving Compass and Philanthropy New York. We thank them for their support. As we begin the webinar, CDP acknowledges that we are working from the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socio-economic and cultural disaster of colonialism, as well as disasters. We acknowledge when the US was founded, there were exclusions and erasures of Indigenous knowledge about how to appropriately care for these lands, causing environmental destruction and degradation, which has had a significant impact on disaster risk and on communities. We are committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy. We commit ourselves to understand where and how wealth accumulation has harmed people and the earth itself, and the complexities of philanthropy as connected to that truth. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and always be Indigenous land. Please join us and acknowledge the original peoples and their elders, past and present, as well as future generations. Just a reminder of the goals of the webinar. 1, have an increased understanding of data sources and how this is useful for decision-making. 2, develop an enhanced understanding of what is available to guide giving. 3, build a heightened commitment to collect, analyze, and share information. Let's start with a very basic review. And this is good for me as I'm not much of a data geek, but I do appreciate it. Data is raw material, the facts and figures which relay something specific. It has no organization and provides no detail about the context. It is basic and unfiltered. Information then is data in a context. It has been categorized, calculated, and condensed. It can be expressed in communication through spoken language, graphic displays, or numeric tables. Information is about meaning and forms the basis for knowledge. Knowledge happens when human experiences, data, and information come together. A common definition is from Davenport and Prusak. Knowledge is a fluid mix of framed experience, values, contextual information, expert insight, and grounded intuition that provides an environment and framework for evaluating and incorporating new experiences and information. It originates and is applied in the mind of the knowers. We called this webinar Data to Drive Decisions to highlight the ways that all of the facts and figures about disasters, affected populations, and needs can be transformed and combined with the knowledge and wisdom of funders to impact our decision-making. Now it's my honor to introduce our special guests. I'm looking forward to the information they'll share with us. My colleague, Carrie Cullen, is the director of CDP's Midwest Early Recovery Fund. Previously, Carrie served as the Humanitarian Special Projects Team Lead at Lutheran Social Services of North Dakota, where she worked on disaster case management and recovery programming, served as project manager for the Midwest Consortium for Disaster Services, managed special events for New American Services, and initiated and led the agency's work with victims of labor trafficking. Dr. Andrew Schroeder leads direct relief's work in geographic information system mapping, epidemiological analysis, and humanitarian informatics. He has worked in a consulting and advisory capacity for the United Nations Development Program and the World Food Program. He is the co-founder, along with colleagues at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, of the COVID-19 Mobility Data Network. My friend Dr. Xiaoqi Sim leads the Episcopal Health Foundation's work in health policy analysis, pilot projects, learning collaboratives, research and evaluation portfolio. Dr. Sim currently serves on the board of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum and National Rural Health Resource Center. He also serves on the advisory committee of the Kinder Institute of Urban Research at Rice University and the Asian American Policy Review at Harvard University. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with all of us. Xiaoqi, let's start with you. The Episcopal Health Foundation is not a disaster grant maker. How did you pivot in responding to two major disasters and stay on course in implementing your strategic plan?
Thank you so much, Sally. And really, I want to applaud CDP decision to put on this webinar. I think in times like this, where we still have a major global pandemic, and a lot of wars that are happening right now, this is a very, very timely discussions. So in terms of EHF journey in using data to inform strategy during the disaster, I think I just wanted to kind of like focus, my part of the presentation on Hurricane Harvey that took place in 2017, as well as the global pandemic that we still live under right now, the COVID-19 pandemic. This has always been a question that's being posed to us whenever a disaster hit our region in the greater Houston area in Texas. I guess we are not. I mean, to do some level setting, we are not a disaster grant maker. We are a healthcare conversion foundations. We do have our 5-year strategic plan that our board has approved. We are working on improving community health in Southeast Texas. So of course, right, when all these unpredictable and messy events happen in Houston, Texas, I think just as a regular human beings, our gut feeling often is about how could we react this have some react this in a very, very quick fashion. Sometimes when the emotion is still very raw, there's always this urge to want to like take some actions versus being a little bit more intentional and thoughtful. I think this really came across during Hurricane Harvey, where all our staff, including myself, I mean, we were personally, we were evacuated from our homes and houses, apartments, for at least from a week to 2 weeks, being displaced ourselves. So when we came back to the office a couple of weeks after Hurricane Harvey, we felt like, there must be something that we could do to help our neighbors, help our communities. But at the same time, we always know that things just don't happen in a vacuum, that we are not the only funder in town. In fact, this is not even kind of in our sweet spots. So I think there is a very important kind of like framing to this conversation, in that we have to understand our work in the larger context of an ecosystems, right, of funders, of providers, of populations and communities that are being impacted. And I would strongly urge that as we think about our own, as I'm reflecting on our own work during Hurricane Harvey and COVID-19, we often ask a lot of questions about what is the value add our foundation can bring to the table. How could we complement and support others' work, as well as opportunities for funders collaborations. No one needs to be able to figure out that this is that you could do it all by yourself. So that's one major point. I guess the second major point is as a health philanthropy, we always look very deeply in terms of beyond the grant making, beyond the money, what other type of work we could bring to the table in terms of adding value. Things like data and research, mapping, stuff that I'll be sharing later on. How do we best engage community stakeholders? How do we build capacity of organizations? Those are things that we often look for, in our toolbox when we are dealing with disasters. And also, I guess, again, as a non-disaster grantmakers, we often see our engagement and our involvement, especially in the context of Hurricane Harvey, as very time limited, with a very specific goal being laid out. And when we feel like there are others that are coming in, joining the funders landscape, we are completely okay stepping away and exiting the scene. I think that's the pivot, that's the being flexible and also being able to pivot, between a time limited disaster, to let's pay more attention, to our regular grant making or our regular strategic plan priorities. Let me stop there. There's definitely a lot of richness in terms of kind of like what I just shared.
Well, I can say, Xiaoqi, that your data and research and engagement in Hurricane Harvey certainly helped us direct our funding appropriately and more strategically. So thank you for that work. Carrie, when conducting a regional needs assessment, what information should funders consider?
Well, thanks, Sally. And, I'm super excited to share a little bit about what we call our early recovery needs assessment program. So I work primarily in a 10-state region where most of the disaster events are low attention. So I think to just build off of what Dr. Sim said at the beginning was that the information post-disaster event is often really messy. And I would contend kind of difficult to find, especially at the community level or in smaller or less resourced communities. So I'm not a data scientist or a researcher, but as a practitioner, I have learned that there is information that would be really useful in understanding the how and the who is impacted after disaster and the what we should do. So when we started developing our needs assessment process, and we started thinking about regional and local needs assessment, we started with a question. We said, imagine, what would we do if we had accurate, timely data about low attention disasters that would help us to make those better data-informed decisions? And so I started out by asking questions along with that question and really basically getting at this, what do you need? I asked funders, I asked practitioners, I asked community leaders across the region who had recent disaster experience. And from those surveys, we generated, and I would say with the help of some pretty smart data and community assessment experts, a list of indicators that really for us fall into these three categories. So the first indicator list comes in the impact. So what actually happened during this disaster event. So we're looking at what vulnerabilities and barriers were highlighted or emerged as a result of the disaster that we really need to consider as we think about recovery. The second category was these vulnerability indicators, or the pre-existing conditions in the community that might highlight some inequities in some places where we really need to consider as we think about recovery. So those things look like the density, the isolation of the community, the access to resources, the composition of that population, the social, environmental, and health factors. What's land use look like in that region? What does the economy rely on? And really the history of disaster and the experience that community or area has with disaster. And then we layer on top of that the capacity indicators. So what capacity and assets are existing in that community or region for recovery and for those efforts. So we try to collect most of those vulnerability indicators are from secondary sources that are readily available. And so we have set up a system where that is all collected and ready at our fingertips. And then what we can do is add that primary data around the impact and the capacity of the community as we're learning about them to that and generate a scorecard, which helps us decide where and how we're going to engage with the community. And one of the things that I'm really like to point out a lot is that we do all that, we collect all the information, we have that, and really careful to share that with community, to not sit and own it, but whenever possible to pass it on, especially to those communities that may not have that ability to kind of set up that system and assess their own needs in that way. So I look forward to the continued conversation here today about data.
Y'all, I get to work with her every day, and every time she speaks, I learn something. So she's an amazing colleague. Andrew, I'd love to hear from you next. Can you show us what a data-driven decision looks like?
Maybe. I'll do my best. And I guess I would like to take it from kind of two levels. One level, actually talking about a decision, and I think the second is problematizing the question of like, what is a decision, and how are we actually attaching data to different dimensions of a decision? Since I think what we tend to mean when we're asked about data-driven decision-making is actually a fairly tactical kind of question. You know, where did you put the hurricane preparedness pack, which facility, which place, and have data to back up that. But as we'll get into a little bit, I think it's much more complex than that, and much more interesting than that. So, you know, one example recently has been around, say, the refugee influx into Eastern Europe from Ukraine, which we've been heavily involved with at Direct Relief since the invasion took place. But as we know, there's a lot of people. So we see the data from UNHCR all the time about, say, over 2.5 million people have moved into Poland. But it turns out that this is a highly clustered population, right? So where are they going makes a big spatial difference. And when we're thinking about a data-driven decision, like, say, which areas of Poland require the most attention in terms of access to health resources because refugees actually may increase pressures on the health system, that's not like a uniform surface across the country. It's actually highly clustered. So the map that you're looking at is based upon analysis that we did of mobile phone users through the Facebook application, clustering in different areas relative to a pre-invasion baseline. And you can see that there's been this high concentration within Warsaw and the surrounding area of Warsaw, but not only Warsaw, it's several other cities throughout the south, and then up into Gdansk in the north. That's not the only places, but it does then give you a sense of relative prioritization across this space of Poland. And that can then lead this resource allocation question, which is, you know, which places ought we prioritize for different reasons if we know that this is not an undifferentiated movement, it's actually a highly clustered movement. But as you see, like, decision-making is actually, you know, a multi-part process, right? So like, data is relevant at each one of the kind of moments identified within this continuum. So to some degree, you know, the first data-driven decision is simply tell me about whether or not the population that's moved into Poland is clustered or smooth. And that's identifying a problem as to where we might actually consider prioritization and might require a whole lot of other data sources that begin to think about other dimensions of the problem just beyond the raw population count. And then this goes around to being able to identify alternatives. So a data-driven decision here might mean that we think about whether, you know, what might happen if we were to put let's say, focus everything within Warsaw, as opposed to a more uniform distribution might involve questions around equity and other things. And that goes all the way up to post hoc evaluation. So a data-driven decision on the post hoc evaluation level might actually then turn out to be whether we can actually collect data from areas, which we're seeing on the map here, you know, future maps that show change over time, and then think about what was the consequence of our resource allocation decision. And each one of these moments, I think, is like an element of data-driven decision-making. So by thinking in that way, I think we can resist this highly tactical question of like, literally, which health facility should I go to, and think much more, I think, in an integrated way about how we identify problems, how we respond to those problems, and how we evaluate what it is that happened as a result of our decisions.
Andrew, let's stay with you. Can you describe the difference in using data following a disaster and a complex emergency like in Ukraine?
Sure. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about, I guess, staying with displacement as the theme. So, each disaster involves some level of displacement. It's a common occurrence throughout evacuation patterns. It's also a characteristic of all complex emergencies. All complex emergencies involve mass displacement of some kind. So one of the commonalities in terms of how we would kind of use data to think about the situation in a post-disaster, post-emergency kind of context is where we would understand the kind of flows of displacement and the flows of population, so that we could answer some of the questions I was talking about earlier with Poland, say, where we're thinking about resourcing, focusing attention on areas where we're most likely to see population movement, or conversely, where communities that may have had people leave but not be fully, say, emptied, may have people that are at elevated risk simply because they've been left behind by a disaster. So that tactical kind of question links into this broader strategic priority, and that can be something which links the two. One of the real distinctions, though, is the security environment that we see a lot of these happening in now. And I think the situation in Ukraine is really instructive. In the early days of the invasion, a couple days after the 24th of February, there was a decision made by Google to turn off their data, to disable the traffic patterns that could be visible inside Google Maps in Ukraine. The focus for that was around the dual use nature of big data in a complex emergency context where there's a conflict happening, where targeting of areas of the country was occurring through observation of density patterns within the traffic, so that by making sort of large scale data open, we would then have potential negative consequences up to and including attacks happening by the Russian military on areas where they could see roads being trafficked, say. And this, to me, is actually something that poses a central kind of tension around how we've thought about big data and disasters for some time now, where there's been a real emphasis overall on kind of open data sharing, to say the more data, the better, right? The more we can like open up data, make it available, bring a global community together around it, digital humanitarianism, the more we're going to show results when we think about kind of the impact factors that we described earlier. In a conflict situation, this is very complicated and maybe the exact opposite of the case, where data sensitivity becomes much of a stronger issue. We need to think very clearly about who is able to access data, why they would access it, what the consequences of that access might be, and how that would relate to different levels of sensitivity. There ought to be kind of requirements to share certain things, but a real responsibility that escalates. It's not like that responsibility is not present in disasters, but as we can see in the Ukraine situation, it's just really at a whole other level. And I want to give a lot of credit to the team at UN OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data for taking the time in this conflict to really advance their own thinking about data sensitivity guidelines, and have published a whole set of new things that we can reference about trying to grade data according to some of these kind of questions around dual use consequences. So that's at least one way to think about it.
My oversimplification probably is that data can be used for good and for bad, right? Xiaoqi, let's move to you now. How have you used a mixed methods approach to present credible and timely data to inform decisions?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, the most important value for us, I guess as a researcher, as a data person, that work within a philanthropist, is always, kind of like, stay true to this value that, as much as, we would love to kind of like propose and implement, the most perfect way of collecting data, of telling the stories, the world is messy around us. there's tons of, very fluid and, evolving situations, so I mean, to be a little bit geeky about this, I mean, this is something that we all learn in graduate school about, really thinking about how could you best triangulate your data sources, your storytelling, your methodologies, and this is the approach that I continue to strongly believe in. So, coming back to the Texas context, what we've been doing is we are using a variety of different tools, including polling projects to, some more real-time mapping efforts, on the Harvey disaster data and the COVID data. We also even, get into the economic analysis space, if there's a little bit more time, as we think through the implications of the pandemic, especially in the context of hospitalization or deaths, on health disparity for Black and Hispanic Texans. What does that mean in terms of, revenue losses for the state of Texas? So it's really, how you could kind of best use all these different type of data to to really help to inform real-time discussions on the grant making strategies as well as policy conversations. Next slide, please. So again, this is just literally kind of like sharing with you that since Hurricane Harvey, we have done everything, when it comes to the polling project, from assessing the impact of Texas, of the pandemic, on Texas residents. We have done some deeper dive analysis on COVID-19 vaccine uptake. As we know, these are still things that are very fresh, in our daily life. Next slide. And this slide, what this slide is showing is that right after the Hurricane Harvey in Southeast Texas, we try to kind of do some sense making about where are some of the data beside a more regular type of research. So we were able to access FEMA applications by census block group. We were also able to do some overlaying of that, with social vulnerability index, in the Harris County area, and all this is really trying, trying to put out information that is timely, relevant, to colleagues, like Sally and as well as others to figure out what neighborhoods and community we should be, thinking about investing in. Next slide. And and especially thinking about kind of like in the COVID-19 pandemic context, we actually have done two mapping projects. One is to really assist the One Star Foundations. This is a state foundation set up by the governor's office to look at how they could best spend their COVID-19 relief fund in the state of Texas. And we were able to draw on all these public health indicators and resilient indicators to help them kind of like create some priority areas. And then in another effort, we were actually able to provide some mapping analysis to inform the work of a multi-funded collaborative called Your Shots Texas campaign to really increase COVID-19 vaccine confidence, in many of the communities. Yeah, so these are just some different ways that we've been doing it.
And for those of us who are visual learners, the maps were fabulous, especially during Harvey for me personally. Carrie, in our conversation prior to the webinar, you said there is no data without story and no story without data. How can we consider the story when we use quantitative data?
Yeah, so first of all, I stole that statement somewhere along the way, so I don't deserve any credit for it, but really the statement that there's no data without story and no story without data, to me essentially means that data is kind of meaningless without the context to put it in, and that the story without some data can really steer us in some crazy directions if we're relying solely on it. So data cannot and should not shape our interactions and our decisions absent of the faces and stories of those who are living in community and that have lived experience. So my best example of this is one community that we worked in. We had some really initial reports, mostly from media, that there was significant flooding in the community. But when I did my initial outreach and started asking questions, I got two very different stories. I got the story that there's no disaster cause needs here in this community. And I got the story that the needs are so overwhelming, we're not sure what to do. So I heard those two stories and I applied our assessment framework. And I found that this second story had the data to support it. We also then helped that community to gather through some household surveys details about what that need was, and then to make decisions and advocate for additional resources in terms of money and volunteers and goods and materials to assist them. I think that the flip would also be true, that if we had simply looked at the data, we might have missed this particular low attention disaster because the numbers were so small. And without the story to contextualize it, we would have missed that there was a heavy impact of this disaster on overcrowded and multi-generational households. We didn't see that the mold in the data. We didn't see food shortages causing serious health concerns and issues that were related to the schools and the behavioral health of kids in the schools and the clinics and other service providers along the way. And we wouldn't have seen the hundreds of years of systemic racism and inequities that had put these precious families in such a precarious position to begin with. So what we do in that assessment is we have that data and we have information, we start to analyze it, we approach it with curiosity, but we need to have those stories to allow us to check our assumptions and our biases, and really needs to be part of our strategy and our actions. So we need data plus the story to get that full context. And I say this, like, we should be using data as a highlighter of what needs exist, but not as a Sharpie, not as a checkbox. Well, I have that information, and so I can cross that off my list. We should use it to check our assumptions and our biases, but we shouldn't be using data to make decisions for communities and individuals and households without them somehow being able to share their story as part of it. We should use the story and relationship to see what's invisible in the data and to provide context for it. And then the data and the story together we should use that to empower and to advocate alongside communities and organizations. And data should be our highlighter, our gut check against our assumptions and our biases. And along with the story, it helps us create recovery plans and strategies to meet real gaps and to really work towards alleviating human suffering.
That so speaks to me, Carrie, and why I've become a bigger fan of data, but always incorporating the story with it. Andrew, like Carrie, you had an interesting quote you shared with us previously when you said data isn't just numbers, it's a social relationship. Can you share more about this?
Yeah, I think this is one of the core ideas, actually, of this conversation. I think the other kind of quote to link to that is the idea that data is people. So one way to look at this is that, like, this is a map that you're looking at of cholera risk in Mozambique following Cyclone Kenneth in 2019. And, it's important to remember that this is a map of individuals that are going through really extraordinary consequences, and not just a set of abstract colors on a landscape. So, this has consequences for how we think about ethics, for how we think about the ethics of data collection, the ethics of analysis, and the purpose for which we're actually doing any particular kind of analysis. We're doing it to transform a situation, to make sure that people get access to vaccines and other kind of health equipment in the context, in this case, of a cholera outbreak. But it means something more than that. And that's why I put the concept of translation in, because so you're looking not only at a map here, but you're looking at a model which we developed in the wake of the cyclones in Mozambique to anticipate the risk of the spread of cholera throughout an area based upon several factors. So There's a bunch of analysis that goes into this model, but in order to produce that model, which looks like a map with a bunch of boxes that you can input case numbers into, it requires a social relationship that translates amongst several different institutions that have different purposes, that have different conditions around the data. So, like in the middle is our research team, which in this case was a shared effort between researchers at Harvard School of Public Health, at Direct Relief, and with our colleagues at NetHope, as well as the health cluster, which is managed by WHO, which links into one set of decision makers that are posing questions to data and are asking us about purpose, and that link operationally into the Ministry of Health in this case, who are making tactical decisions about vaccination. So the campaign itself is carried out through a team of people, set of teams at the neighborhood level, managed by a different organization at the Ministry of Health, and that in order to build the model, you actually have to engage not only case data, which goes back to the data is people portion of the equation that I talked about earlier, but endemicity studies. So, what is the underlying risk of cholera? This actually emerges from public health research that's then transformed into an input into the model. Remote sensing of the flood imagery. So water makes a big difference on cholera and the damage to sanitation infrastructure. That is collected from satellites. In this case, we used Maxar. Weather and climate data that gives you kind of a baseline risk around fluctuations in the El Nino pattern that translate into an understanding, a contextual understanding of the remotely sensed flooding imagery, high resolution settlement data, which came from, in this case, social media, where the company Facebook again has done work with Columbia University to disaggregate census data into very, very small 10-kilometer chunks, and so we can look at very precise dynamics according to that set of high-resolution estimations, and then movement dynamics. I mean, in this case, we had to use estimations through a gravity model, which gives you an estimate based upon location as a pull, from higher density places relative to low density places, but we also looked at mobility of devices which were sparse, so we had to kind of remove it. That whole complex is a social relationship. We don't get to the point of being able to do modeling and risk analysis without being able to navigate our way through the purpose, through multiple institutions, and through the coordination efforts that allowed us to respond to questions that were being posed through the vaccination campaign. So that, to me, is what we get at with implementation.
Thanks, Andrew. You say data is people, and I say that's absolutely true. And it's a tool. It's a tool that we can use in our toolbox, but certainly not the only tool. And Carrie, going back to you now, when there's so much information available at our fingertips, you mentioned several options. How do you choose what to use to inform decisions?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think what I've seen over the last couple of years, really with the advancement in technology, and then I think the necessity that we saw in having some really accurate and timely data about the pandemic, it really has greatly increased the availability of data that is there at our fingertips. And so for me as a practitioner, it can be really overwhelming to go out and to pick and choose. And, again, I suspect like that many of you like me maybe aren't data scientists or trained analysts. So I find that with that lack of data and information, I think there's really two things that most people do. They either move into decisions really quickly without that and just forge ahead, or they get frozen and stuck in place and they can't go anywhere. So instead of being daunted by the task, I think it's best that we really start with questions. So what do you really want to know? And why do you want to know it? Why do you need that information? So for me, for example, I wanted to know, what are those pre-existing conditions in the community and inequities that are potential barriers to equitable disaster recovery? What is the immediate or seen impact of the disaster event on the community? And what are the potential gaps in capacity or ability for a community to recover independently? the who is impacted, how were they impacted, and what are some places and some gaps that we can really step in to fill. So the first thing is to really understand what questions are you asking before you go and approach some of these large data sets. Then I would say this, so shop in a smaller grocery store. So for me, in short, here's where I come with that. I spent 18 months living in a community outside the United States with limited access to food. When I came back, my first trip to the grocery store left me in tears, like literally on the ground in tears. So why do we have so many choices, and how many choices do we need? So my solution at that point was to stop the tears was to really shop in that smaller store where there was a limited selection. So if I apply that idea to this conversation, for me, there's a couple things, right? So find someone or an organization that has done some of this work in sorting through all of the sources and ask them, say, these are our questions. What do you suggest? So here's just a short list that I've created. The last one on this list is the group that we really partnered with on our early recovery needs assessment. They helped us to really design and to think through really smartly that data. So find that smaller store and that smaller list, and then choose a few things. Don't always chase the shiny new object, but choose a few things that really are going to meet your needs, and spend some time really digging into the methodology and the context of those sources, and stick with them for a while. So I really think if you combine some of these big data sets that are out there in these maps and these pieces, and you have those, and you've asked the experts, and you've narrowed that in, and then you're also alongside in parallel listening to the community and the stories and the people behind those numbers, I think you'll really be able to make some better decisions and sort through all of that information that's available out there.
I love that. Shop in a smaller grocery store. We'll be moving into our question and answer section in a minute. So please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen if you haven't done so already. We see a few in there already. But first, Xiaoqi, I want to ask, how have you sought out partnership opportunities in communicating your findings?
Yeah, I mean, again, just to piggyback on, what's already been shared, by both Carrie and Andrew, I couldn't agree more about the importance of thinking about data is people, people is data, and also, this notion of, when you have the work done, whether it's a map, whether it's a survey, it's a focus group, or qualitative interviews, I guess us as research scientists or data geek, I mean, I have to be the first to admit that we just do not do a good enough job in terms of socializing, communicating, these findings, in a very, very commonsensical, layman term. I think if anything, this is kind of, a lot of my work here at Episcopal Health Foundation, is really focusing on how could you do another level of summarizations or translating, of all this technical data, so that anyone can understand, what are the implications, what should we do based on the research findings. So what you're seeing, on this slide is that EHF, I would say, as much as we invest in the research effort itself, we are even spending more resources in terms of finding communications opportunities, finding opportunities to write, issue brief and research blogs, or translate, or trying to promote it, through social media, as well as, op-ed opportunities, calling attention to the findings. I think these are all very important. And I'll go back to how I started, this presentation early on, which is, this whole notion of, let's not just do this work by yourself, by just one organizations. There's an ecosystem of funders, of stakeholders, and community groups out there, that we should actively seek out, partnership with. And Sally, you and I, and Chris Hansman from the, from the Harvey Relief Fund, we had such a great time making the road trip, to present the data, to engage stakeholders. in many of the important relief and rebuilding priorities, in the Texas region after Hurricane Harvey. And I would say that, that work, continues to be a priority for our foundation in terms of, how we could assist other funders, other philanthropists in thinking through, their grant-making strategies. Something that we haven't done too much, but we are starting to get into it is let's look at how our data, could actually shape and change policy. I think it's especially true, in the COVID-19 pandemic, that we are seeing all these health disparity, health equity concerns, they're being exacerbated by the pandemic, and what we can do about it based on the data that that we've been able to generate. So this is an ongoing journey. No one is perfect, and I really, on that note, really appreciate CDP for putting together this webinar, and and enjoy all these great insights from others. Thank you.
Thank you, Shachi. Yes, we did travel the state together and share a lot of your data and information with other organizations to help inform their work as well. It was so useful. Thank you for that. And we're going to move now to the Q&A section. So we have several questions that we received in advance, and I'll be working through that list as well as any that we're receiving in the Q&A box. As a reminder, CDP webinars are aimed at providing education for the philanthropic community. So while all of you are welcome to pose a question, we will first focus on those addressing funder issues. And I want to ask this question. I think maybe we've touched on it a little bit, but how can funders shift away from relying so much on NGOs to collect so much data? We know that oftentimes when we're trying to fund our local community organizations, grassroots organizations, that when we ask them to collect and analyze data, that may be a bit more than, that may be a burden to them. So how can we shift away from relying on them and look to other ways to find that information we need? Carrie, I'll turn to you for this one.
Well, I think that the first thing I would say is that really goes back to understanding what's already out there and available, and so not asking them to duplicate that. So for example, if you want to understand kind of the demographics of the population of their community, like you can easily go on to a couple different websites here in the US and get some of that kind of detail and that information without asking that nonprofit or that grantee to come up with that information for you. So, and then when you have that information, instead of asking them for it, you check it with them and say, hey, like this is what the data is telling us about the composition of your community. Is that right? Are those the people that are showing up at your door and needing assistance? What are we missing when we look at that? So I think the first thing really is to say that, if the data is out there and available in another source, don't ask that nonprofit, especially if they're in the middle of a really busy recovery, to go find it and get it for you. You can take the time to go and get it and understand it yourself.
Thanks, Carrie. Absolutely. Darlene asked an interesting question, and Andrew, I might ask you to answer if you can. Has there ever been a situation where the data does not align with the stories and voices from the people that are being impacted? And if not, or if it has, how would you resolve that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, in other words, where the voices of community members impacted is not the same as what the data tells you should be happening in an area. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why this would happen. I mean, one is that, not to downplay individual voices, but, often that's a anecdotal sample as opposed to the data, which actually is maybe able to capture a kind of broader trend. I think to some degree it could cut the other way too, in the sense that I think that Carrie mentioned this earlier, in the sense that you can have a set of assumptions baked into, say, baseline data about inequality that only tell you a portion of the qualitative experience of inequality. And so when you have voices telling you about dimensions of, say, the lived experience of inequality, and what it's like to, go through day-to-day life, that can prompt a set of decision-making that, the data alone doesn't capture. So then you have this divergence. At some level, I think it means that the answer to that is to not settle for one source ever, right? So you don't base all of your decision making only off of a set of anecdotal comments that people might make about what's happening in an area. You always actually check it with data, and you never only use data, or only one source of data in particular, in order to make a set of decisions. You have to actually think about a pretty comprehensive view. So mosaicing data sets and mosaicing that with the voices of the community gives you usually the strongest interpretation of the truth. So, I think that's a practice that, requires a certain kind of mental agility and fluidity that requires people to get better at that, and get better at how we communicate that that sort of complex pattern, rather than simply saying that one or another is true.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. One of the questions that came in beforehand that I have a particular interest in Xiaoqi, I know you probably will as well, because you traveled with me to visit several of these groups. How can a long-term recovery organization use data to influence its funders?
Well, I think this is fairly consistent in terms of kind of what's been already said at this webinar. I mean, Andrew just touched on it. This whole notion of let's think about using mixed methods or various type of data sources to be able to convey the message or tell a story. I think if the long-term recovery organizations does have this kind of like capacity of creating some sort of a data dashboard, some sort of a data profile that allow them to be able to to tell their story, that'll be great. I also couldn't agree more with the notion that we shouldn't just be relying on one level of effort. I mean, in social science research, there's this term called social desirability bias, right? I mean, especially in the context of qualitative interview, sometimes folks that tend to want to talk to you are folks that are more motivated, have more of a kind of a personal bias and things, but this is where sometimes if we do have that kind of capacity and resources, we can use multiple methods and multiple sources, to verify, both the validity and reliability, of the information, that we are getting. But I think to the heart of your question, Sally, it's at the end of the day, it's really about capacity issue. It's really about bandwidth and having the expertise. And I think as funders, whether we are disaster funders or non-disaster funders, I mean, as we are asking, those questions of the CBOs and the nonprofits that we would like to support, I mean, we should always, be very sensitive and respectful about, this additional information or questions that you're asking of them. Is it going to add, an unfair or unnecessary burden on the non-for-profit or the CBOs, that we are trying to support? And if so, can we provide them some additional resources so that, they can create that kind of capacity, to answer the questions that we have for them?
Exactly. Thank you, Xiaoqi. One more question, and then I think we're going to have to wrap things up. But I'm wondering if any of you have seen a data model that has been able to show or verify overall community improvement or recovery, that what was done worked. Carrie? 'Cause
You know what? I might have to pass that to somebody else. I don't have anything right at my fingertips right now.
Andrew, have you seen something?
I'm not sure that I have actually. I mean, and it's a really interesting question as maybe as to why not. I don't know, maybe it's the way that the language is framed around overall data model that demonstrates that something works. I mean, you know, when we evaluate what works, you know, when we think about whether that's a issuing of a grant to a grantee and then monitoring whether or not they achieve their results, you know, we apply standard logic models to that. We think about, you know, what their, you know, how do we understand reduction of, say, disease incidence relative to the input of a set of health commodities and funds. I mean, we can show in an isolated sense often that activity took place. We can often show that, we can clearly show that resources were expended in the correct way. I find that we often end up, it's not a modeling question, it's often a kind of duration question and a confounding variables question. So, you know, humanitarian programs, public health programs never occur in isolation. You know, they're always occurring in the context of a bunch of factors you can't control for. We don't really submit study designs for remote, for a randomized control trial by and large. And even if we did, it's there's a whole bunch of other confounding factors around those. And, you know, we, therefore, we often are also in like a context where we're, you know, it's a luxury to have 3 years worth of studying something. Often it's less than 3 years. And so, you know, often change doesn't play out within the time frame that's relevant to the funding available. And that just seems like endemic to the problem. So we end up repeating a lot of the output variables, a lot of the activity variables, and then end up with episodic kind of looks at, you know, estimation of change. Again, not showing that things didn't happen the way we thought they would, but often don't necessarily show you that disease incidence overall was reduced, or that you know, this was reduced in a way that's meaningful and transferable to another situation. This to me is the limits of often the randomized control trials, where there's a ton of methodology showing, say, that malarial bed nets work in a particular context, but once you take it out of that context and you say move it from Kenya to Mozambique, you know, and you have a whole bunch of other cultural factors and maybe conflict factors, replicability even of a relatively intensive study with a lot of modeling is very hard to actually verify. So I think this is actually endemic to the entire community, and requires a lot of thinking, not only about the modeling and the data, but how we structure and, you know, the resources for this, and what's a reasonable expectation for understanding what worked.
That sounds like it might be a whole other a whole other webinar for us to address. So I'm going to wrap things up now. That is all the time we have for questions today. But as we do begin to wrap up, I want to provide the audience with some thoughts from our conversation. Don't be intimidated by data. And I say this to myself. Data is especially quantitative data can be very intimidating for a lot of people. But as our speakers have shown us, it doesn't have to be. Start small in the small grocery store and let your knowledge and skills grow. Use freely available resources. We'll share a list of some of these resources that we've mentioned and others that our team uses when we share the webinar recording next week. While we highly encourage you to build in the cost for data and evaluation into your grants and into your own operations, don't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of data and information already available to you. And ask the experts. By this, we mean local community experts and academic data experts. As our speakers have highlighted, data and information need the human touch to become knowledge. At CDP, we recognize that no matter how much data we look at, we will still need to incorporate the voice of the community and experts into our decision-making process. If you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to go visit CDP's brand new website. On it, you will find many resources that can assist you. The issue insights provide an introductory look at disasters and responses. Disaster profiles provide regular information about the impact of a disaster and the needs of the community. to inform philanthropy on how they can help. The Disaster Philanthropy Playbook is now hosted on our main site and provides numerous resources for those planning disaster funding. There's a monthly newsletter full of information and blogs, including our weekly What We're Watching blog that highlights disasters around the world. CDP staff team are always available to provide guidance, and if you need more in-depth assistance, they also provide a variety of consulting services. You can find more information about our work at disasterphilanthropy.org. Please join us on May 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for our next webinar, Using Indigenous Knowledge to Prevent and Respond to Disasters. And please take a moment to complete our post-webinar survey to let us know what you liked and what you would like to see in future webinars. It'll pop up automatically when you exit. In order to respect everyone's time and keep this to an hour, which it is right now, this is all the time we have for today's webinar. Thank you so much to our co-sponsors and to Carrie, Andrew, and Xiaoqi for taking time to share their insights with us. If you have questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to Tanya at tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. And thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great afternoon.